All right, so I got my PhD in information science from the University of Chicago, and that was one of the first major programs to be closed in the spate of closings that took place in the 1980s. I just want you to know that. But and then I was the last professor at the closing of the school at Columbia University. But I've had 2 jobs since then, and one for 17 years, and I've been here 6 years, so I think we're okay. So the University of Chicago's Graduate Library School was formed in 1926 by the Carnegie Foundation with an endowment to cause the inculcation of scientific thinking in application to the problems of bibliography and librarianship. And I'm telling you that because most of the other schools were schools of practice, how to do cataloging, how to buy books, how to shelve, how to build a building, how to answer reference questions, and so on. Someone thought the principles of science should be applied to problems which later became known as information science. And so that was really the ethos of the school when I entered it in 1982. And it took me 10 years to get my PhD. I finished in 1992, 5 years after the school was closed. And I believe I was the last graduate. At any rate, when I took research methods, which was the very first course we took, you didn't have anything else until you had that, they taught us 2 things. Or really just one thing. The one thing was that there is good research and there's everything else. And good research is scientific research based on probability theory and constructed with derivative hypotheses and building theory. And everything else was called bad research. So I got my degree, and then I went to Columbia University, and there for 6 years I taught doctoral research methods. And then when that program closed, I went to Long Island University, and we started a new PhD, and there I taught qualitative research methods. And I had to gulp every time I started teaching qualitative methods, because here I was teaching bad research, or what I had been taught was bad research. So later I began to figure out that there are actually different paradigms of thought underlying the 2 structures. And other than that, they're pretty much the same. They're empirical in nature, which means they're derived on observation. Now, in all my years of teaching, and especially in teaching seminars, I've discovered that whatever we've learned in class about research methods doesn't necessarily translate to that moment when you're staring at your set of problems and you're going, oh gosh, I don't know what to do. What exactly do I have to do here? So that's what I want to tell you about today. I'm probably not going to tell you anything you haven't heard before or won't hear again, but I'm going to try to give you some practical advice from my point of view about how research can evolve in a structured way. If you if I get all the way through the handout, you'll see there are 2 exercises at the end. We'll see how that goes. And if you don't get done with those today, you can drop by my office anytime. I'm always glad to help. Or you can take my seminar in the spring and practice further. So that's my bit of introduction. I don't know most of you, so it would be useful to me if you would tell me something about each of you. I'll start. I know Jeanette. So
are you going to tell us something? Oh, I'm Tyler. In the PhD program, I'm already on my 2nd plate.
I'm Elizabeth. I'm actually a master's product for the PhD program. I'm just trying to get an idea of maybe if this is something I want to jump into, I guess.
Okay. I'm Jeanette, and
just tell us your topic.
travel libraries and classification.
Very good. I'm her co-chair, that's why I know.
I'm Nadine, I'm faculty, just visiting. I'm Melissa Castillo, new, PhD student, and I'm interested in probably more of the emotional aspects of information seeking, possibly with more of a gendered look at it.
Okay, my name is Musa from Nigeria. I'm interested on more digital preservation of local content of Nigeria and like build another way of building a platform for sharing of digital resources.
Chris, you know you.
Ours. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Paparis. I'm a fifth-year PhD student working on my dissertation. And the work I do looks at the social and policy implications of new media technologies and the information flows they create.
Okay.
I'm Hyun-Soo Park, I'm a second-year student, and I major in representation, and I want to study data science in cultural heritage or digital humanities, and I'm featured research assistant.
Hi, I'm Laura Reitner. I'm a second-year student. I'm his student. So I'm knowledge organization, but my major says information organization, and there's a dispute over that. And I'm looking at boundary objects.
Hi, I'm Young Choi. I'm third year. I'm still struggling with finding the good topic for my dissertation. And I'm studying knowledge organization, of course. Yeah.
I'm Hee-Jung-han. I'm going to take up filming this October. My research includes the children's information seeking.
I'm Renee Kuzniak. I am a fourth-year PhD student, and I'm working on my proposal on baby boomers and mobile technology and the challenges that they have.
Yeah, let me help you with that.
I am Adriana McClear. I'm a fourth-year doctoral student, and I'm focused on intellectual freedom and access to information, specifically looking at censorship cases.
Hi, I'm Ping Liu I'm a visitor scholar from School of Information Management, Wuhan University, China. I'm really interested in information retrieval and information organization.
I'm the first year PhD student who really want to write a paper. So I'm focusing on the information retrieval right now. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Danielle. I'm a little bit sick, so my voice may be not so loud. So I'm a second-year student, and I'm interested in social media and still looking for some interesting topic in this area.
Hi, I'm Yue Hua Zhao. I'm a second-year student. I'm interested in information retrieval and consumer house internet.
It's Tae Lee. It's the first time in the PhD program here, and my interest is in the information policy, especially in the privacy.
Wait a minute. Go ahead.
Hi, Dan. I'm another recycle literature third year looking at information structures underlying online collections of Wikipedia.
I'm Joel. I'm studying information retrieval.
I'm Shin Cai. It's my first year. I'm interested in information retrieval.
I'm Molly, and I'm a new PhD student, and I'm interested in digitization and electronic archiving.
I'm Nicole, and I specialize in information and educational policy. This is my second year in the PhD program.
Okay, so thank you. I would additionally say at the beginning that you have an exceptional resource here. The faculty of SO is constituted of some remarkable researchers who have a really great record, publish innovative work all the time, and they all do extraordinarily careful work. So I'm always scared when I publish something that someone else will see what I've done. But so far I'm okay. But anyway, you have that as a resource here. So that's a good thing. All right, so the first time I taught 40 years ago, I thought it would be nice to just go in and sit down and chat. And I didn't take a syllabus, and the students nearly murdered me because they needed a piece of paper I learned. So I've told all my students from, henceforth when you teach, take them a piece of paper and write syllabus at the top. And it doesn't matter what you put on it, you can change it next week, but everyone will feel better. So I made you a handout. And it's sort of a guide to what I hope I'm going to say, but as you see, I also, like most baby boomers my age, like to talk. So we'll see where I go. The first point is that research is not linear, but it is sequential. Now, what I mean by that, you all know you're supposed to write a literature review, right? And you all think, I'm not sure what you think that's supposed to be. But what I think it's supposed to be is to work backwards from the problem you're trying to solve. What has just been published about this? Not everything imaginable that ever used any of these keywords, but what study has just recently been published about this? And then step back from that. What study preceded that? And what were the influences that caused that study to be generated in the way in which it was generated? So I'm going to show you two examples from my own work that go in sequence, because each study I conduct is always the next step in my brain about the big problem set I'm working on. But when I say they're not linear, I mean that it's not blinders on kind of forward march prospect. It is to say that when I'm studying what I call instantiation, and I discover a certain phenomenon in the OCLC WorldCat, what was my next step? My next step was to go into the basement of an archaeology museum and pour through the archives. And that was to do some qualitative work on how archivists and archaeologists interact and see whether the phenomenon was taking place. The only way to see that was qualitatively. So, in a sense, I took a side tangent to study that problem, and then I came back with a larger set of theoretical statements with which I was able to move the agenda forward. So you might discover that you need to step aside at some point and go off and study on a tangent. Another thing I just finished publishing every little bit of my dissertation 22 years after I wrote it. So, when a study does not equal a document reporting the study. There are many ways to report what you have. And one of the things I had to do was create operational definitions in the first chapter of my dissertation for terms that had never been defined. And I had to do a fair amount of historical work to do that, but there was no place in my scientific report for lengthy history. So it just sat in my file drawer for about 20 years until somebody said, oh, nobody ever wrote about the history of this. And I go, oh, wait. So anyway, sometimes you have to stop and go around and see what's in the other side of the forest and what's down by the pond, and then come back to the matter. But the fact that research is sequential is really critical. Each study must be based on the one that preceded it. You must base your questions on that which already is known. And that goes directly to the point that I was taught at Chicago, where I just made you laugh by saying good and bad research. The point was appropriate research. And appropriate research answers a question that needs to be answered, and answers that question in the way, what is the next answer we need to move forward? All research should be based in a larger purpose. I believe that some of the attitude that we were taught at Chicago came from the rise in higher education in the 70s and 80s. And suddenly there are professors everywhere trying to get tenure, and they're just writing all sorts of nonsense. And the true scientists were saying that's, You can count a bunch of things and write an average, but that's not research. Research is answering an appropriate question and appropriately in the sequence. So that's the starting point for how to do this. In other words, you can't just say, I'm interested in, Suquan's not here, so you can't just say, I'm interested in the semantic web, and then your research question is, what is the semantic web? No, that won't work. So what you have to do is say, well, what is a semantic web? Why are you interested in the semantic web? Why would anybody else be interested in that? What is already known? Okay? And after I asked him those 4 questions, the answer was obvious. Nothing is known about the literature of the semantic web. And that was what he did in my seminar. And that was fairly straightforward because the data were available. They simply had not been gathered together and analyzed before. Okay. So, the purpose is something broad and lofty. Most people will say the purpose of this research is to count the data. And that's not the purpose, that's the objective. The purpose of the research is to advance understanding of X, the phenomenon, whatever it is. So, but the specific purpose is critical. If you just want to know a little bit more because you're interested, I'm not sure that's good enough to get you a $6 million grant from the National Science Foundation. So you need to know why your purpose is useful to society at large. So for instance, the problem I studied and have now studied for decades is the problem of 2 things that look alike but aren't the same in a catalog. It's called the problem of instantiation among information phenomena. And the problem has 2 parts. The first part is that there are too many things under the same name that should be disambiguated, and that's the second problem. There's no disambiguation. Why is that of interest? Because I want to advance information retrieval, bibliographic information retrieval, away from the linear structure of the catalog had in the 70s toward multiple entity structure, which it now may soon have. All right, so purpose is this overarching thing, and then the problem is something quite specific. People can't find this when they look for it. I have a database, and when I use these queries, I do not retrieve 80% of what I know is in the database. Why is that happening? Okay, it's quite a specific problem. The purpose dictates the methodology. The problem dictates the focus and the structure of the research questions. And you have to have both. You can't have just one or the other. If I want to enhance retrieval in that database where people aren't getting 80% of what I know is in there, my purpose is to enhance retrieval. My problem is that they're not getting the recall I expect them to. That dictates an empirical, a quantitative study, an experimental study in which we try different approaches to extract the data we know is there. If the problem is that if the purpose is to enhance information retrieval and the problem is people are having cognitive disorientation with the interface, that suggests to me a qualitative study. Why are they having cognitive disorientation? What is going wrong when they approach that interface that frightens them or scares them away or some other way gets in between them and the information retrieval? So in that way, the purpose dictates the whole methodological structure, and then the specific problem becomes the focus. Now, I talked about these paradigms. I have a different outline than you have on your head. That's why I'm staring at you. All right, item 3 is the question of research questions. This is one of those problems we have in academia. You know, people commonly write about something that appeared 2 paragraphs before, and they say the above paragraph. And I always go, because that's not English. That's not good English. If you're not an American native English speaker, write it down right now. That's not good English. You're the only ones I can convince. The Americans I lost 2 decades ago. The same thing with hopefully and, well, hopefully irregardless what you say.
Oh.
See? All right, so research question used colloquially means the idea here. It's about policy. And that's different from the actual questions that funnel, that drive the methodology. And you have to understand that distinction because you're going to be asked to do both at once. When you have to, when you get farther along, you'll get to, some of you have already done it. We have played this little game in academia where you submit an abstract for research you haven't conducted yet. And then they accept it, and then you actually have to conduct the study. And you've only got 6 weeks to finish and show up with the results. So somehow you have to tell them what the research question is, big RQ, before you have any idea what the little RQ is. And like I said, it's like a game. But you have to understand the distinction between those 2 things. And what I'm talking about today are the little RQs, the ones that derive exactly the data you're going to gather. The big one is just a matter of colloquial speech. So operationally, a research question is like a hypothesis, and by that it means it dictates exactly what data you need, where you will find them, and I have a series of questions here. Down on number 5, how will you know one when you see it? Famous Supreme Court question. Where will you find it? And the answer to that depends on whether you're trying to generalize your results or whether you're looking for grounded theory. And finally, what are the limitations of the data you're using? Now let me step aside from that for a second. I don't know what you're learning in research methods, but let's hope what I'm about to say is consistent with what you're learning. Okay, so we had good and bad research at Chicago in the old days. And then at Long Island we had qualitative research and quantitative research. And now we have something we call mixed methods. And is that what we're teaching here?
We're not teaching the mixed methods yet. You can all pull one.
Okay. Be glad to. All right, so the big thing about the 2 paradigms is that they're not the same thing at all. And if you look especially at the literature of qualitative research, there's always an apologetics chapter. Well, we didn't get a random sample, but it's okay. The kids were nice. I enjoyed it. But you don't need to do that. You don't need to go there because qualitative research doesn't require any kind of sampling. If you're involved in qualitative research, there's no such thing as a sample. Don't even use the word. It's much safer. So qualitative research is based on a theory called symbolic interactionism. And this is a theory that grew out of work by a fellow named Herbert Bloom, and I have a whole lecture about it sometime if you're interested. The theory is that when we interact, what's happening is not what we're actually observing happening, but that some symbolic function is taking place, maybe in our subconscious. And the classic example is that you think I'm a professor because I'm standing up here and talking and you're all sitting there quietly. And Iris is playing along with it. You don't know that I'm really just the dog catcher and I just wandered in because there was free food. But because I pretend to be a professor, your studentness, which you've learned all your life, teaches you to react symbolically to that visage. Okay, so the theory is that everything works that way. So in the qualitative paradigm, what we want to do is find that interaction, isolate it so we can observe it and explain it, because that's maybe why those people are having cognitive problems with the interface. Maybe they're being terrified in some way when they approach it because of some symbolic interaction process that's taking place. The way we study, the way we look for symbolic interactions is generally ethnographically to get as close to the people having the problem as possible, to observe everything we can, to try to experience it from their point of view. Typically, in the qualitative paradigm, there is going to be some background study, but that's not quite the same as what we call literature review. In the other paradigm, because you don't want to confuse yourself by learning too much at the beginning. Because if you do that, then you're going to interject bias into your interactions with the people. So you want to understand the problem, then you want to go live with the people for a year and see what happens. And then you're going to look for grounded theory. And that means you're going to look for other work. Let's say X is the experiment. You're going to look for other work that gives you insight into what you just discovered. So it's generally considered to be an inductive process. You work from one case to the next case. When you're done, you cannot generalize to the whole population. You can only say, this is what happened in the case I observed. But if you do that a few times, then you can generate a hypothesis and move to the other paradigm and begin to test the hypothesis. This paradigm is based on probability theory. And I'm a mathematician. I can't explain probability theory to you in mathematical terms, but I can tell you that the whole idea is that an isolated controlled incident that takes place in my experiment is likely to occur again if I conduct it under the same circumstances, with the probability I can designate a control. So if I have, I have all of you in this room, chances are, if I choose 5 of you at random and write down some characteristic, demographic characteristic, there's some probability that I could calculate after a while that what I learned from the 5 of you would apply to the whole group. It wouldn't necessarily apply to any other group or any other group of doctoral students, but it might. We would have to base that on prior research. So the whole way probability theory works is being able to control those parameters. How do I know the characteristics I'm working with? How do I know exactly the standard deviation of the variable in the population at large versus the population I'm sampling from? And it requires very tight experimental control. It's a deductive method. We ask one question, we gather the answer, we gather the data, we look at the variation, and then we ask the next question after we know what the answer to the first question is. That's why I said it's sequential. By control, I mean we control everything. We control the frame of who we work with, we control where they are, we control how we select them, we control bias in any way possible. Historical bias, I always love that when people think it means, who got elected president, but it doesn't. It means what happened during the time the experiment was going on. Was there an explosion outside? Was there thunder? You may think you're testing your people with a carefully devised instrument. If there's a tornado warning, we'll have to run to the stairs and come back. That's a historical bias. Something has happened to them that will change their performance. There's experimenter bias. We know from sociological research that people try to satisfy the experimenter whenever possible. They try to guess what you're looking for and give it to you. They're famous, are any of you catalogers? Just a minute. There's a famous old, you can either think of him as a godfather of modern cataloging or a crackpot. His name was Sanford Berman, and he was a librarian in Minneapolis, yes. And he was the first one to point out that LC subject headings were not useful for the general public. And he would conduct user studies. And he had a clipboard. He'd go out and stand by the card catalog. And he'd say, "You can't find it, can you?" They'd say, "No." Then he'd go to ALA and say, "See, they can't find anything." Okay, so extreme examples, actually. But that's how experimenter bias works. Okay, so in a quantitative study, all that has to be controlled and either removed or explained. So when we're working on research questions in the two paradigms, we're concerned with fundamentally different sorts of things. In qualitative research, it's best for phenomena that are new, or unstudied, and probability theory is best for phenomena that either have been studied enough that we can now begin to classify observations, or we can begin to test hypotheses to understand why there are differences in the classified observations. So that's critical as well. If what you want to know is something that's never been studied before, the best thing is to find one and study it exhaustively. And that's utterly qualitative. And if you have something about which there are 3 decades of empirical research, then what you need to do is understand that research intimately so that you know what the next step is toward theory. Do you understand how theory develops? Some of you are nodding. Theory develops when the hypothesis has been tested over and over and over, and the same result keeps coming up. And no different result ever comes up. So that we can say, we can never say we've proven something, but we can say in 99.9% of the experiments, the result was the same. Therefore, we think, therefore it becomes a theory, not a law, we think that this holds true for the population at large. So even the little work you're doing in your classes, shouldn't call it little, it can grow into a giant dissertation. Even that work must find its place in one paradigm or the other. As for mixing the methods, it's all right to do that as long as you understand what you're doing. You can't mix them simultaneously. You can have a qualitative step and quantitative steps in the same project. But you have to design them differently and appropriately. So how am I doing? All right, so I was going to try to show you an example from my own work, and that's always dangerous, but just if the screen comes. All right, this is a study that I'm engaged in at present. So what can I tell you? I am deeply empirical. So from my earliest education, I have been stuck in statistical mindset. So I approach everything from that point of view. Also, I'm an INTJ, from Myers-Briggs, and I'm off the chart on all 4 of those. I really do prefer to sit by myself in a dark room and run statistics. Okay, well, I like to have fun too. So the idea was, what do we know about classification that can teach us something when we think about it from the point of view of data mining. And I'm going, well, now how can I do that? How can I do that? Suddenly it occurred to me, well, I had this result in my dissertation, yes, 20 years ago, 22 years ago. And you don't have to read well, you don't have the text. You can find it online if you want. The point was that right here you see 0.2, and right here you see 0.01. And in those two cases, the presence of this classification symbol told me the probability that I would find, with which I would find multiple additions in the catalog if I just drew a random sample. And I go, aha, the classification tells me something about the bibliographic characteristics. We don't think of it that way, do we? We usually think of classification as telling us something about the subject and subject grouping of documents. But I thought, well, what if it's true that the classification really does tell us something about the structure of the knowledge in the documents? So I wanted to look at that problem. I had this one tiny table for my dissertation, so it was a bit of a leap of faith. I also had, it's hard to do that, here we go. This body of knowledge, some of you may have heard about my Idea Collider project. This is a project fueled by bringing forward the historical work of Paul Ledlet and the Institute for Universal Bibliography from the 1870s, from Belgium, from the time when we thought all the world would be wonderful soon and there would be no more problems and bibliography would solve all the world's problems, as you see it's done today. So anyway, what we discovered was, curiously, that there are quite a lot of theoretical physics in bibliographical notions from the period 1870 till about 1950. I'm just finishing a study of American documentation, looking for definitions of the word concept. American documentation was Jesus before it was Jesus, published from 1950 to 1969. There's theoretical physics, quantum mechanics, all through that discussion about bibliographical concepts. So the idea is that we can look at quantum theory, and it tells us that we can combine different dimensions of knowledge in a faceted way, just as the universe is multidimensional, not unidimensional. We just see one dimension, but we know there are others. We could conceive of a classification that is multidimensional. So the idea was we would begin with Outley's classification, the UDC, Universal Decimal Classification, and see how we could add to it other kinds of dimensional approaches to the structure of knowledge. And what we're looking for are, I can give a lecture on this some other time, what we're looking for are structural similarities that are not semantic. In other words, we want to be able to find two resources that are actually related to each other, but they don't say that they are. But we can find that they're related because we know something about the way they're structured and where they came from. So that's that problem, and I put that together with the earlier problem. And this is what I mean about research is not linear, but it is sequential. The third problem is this bit here. I was hired in 2011. Not hired. I work with a Dutch research group at the Royal Academy of the Arts and Sciences in Amsterdam, and their job in Dutch research is to investigate what we call digital humanities here. And they had a project to download the whole Wikipedia and analyze it from underneath and measure the growth of the knowledge of each phenomenon by saying when something was added and when a link was added and when a reference was added and so forth across time. The data source, they got the whole Wikipedia December 31st, 2009, and it was so big they had to use the grid at CERN to run the data, and it took 6 months. And so while it was churning 6 months, the team thought, well, we need to compare this to a stable reference bibliographic classification. because with that we can see exactly how knowledge grew through literature over some period of time. The universal decimal classification is perfect because we had 125 years of it. It's not as widely used as things like Dewey, so we could be pretty sure how it had been used. There had never been an edition of the whole thing, so we could get inside their files and compile it ourselves, and it was relatively untouched by human hands. So now I'm combining three experimental streams. I'm thinking, let's see how these three go together, and that's what I mean by sequential. So what we knew from, so we had the idea about structure and relationships. We knew from my prior research that classification, LC classification, could predict the occurrence of bibliographical phenomena, and we knew from the UDC study with the Wikipedia, which I won't show you here, exactly how knowledge had grown across the 20th century. Along the way, we've been given 9 million OCLC records with universal decimal classification numbers in them. And we wanted to know whether UDC could be used with predictive power the way that first example of LC classification had been. So 9 million records were too many for me to read in the 6 weeks between the abstract and the paper. But using the proportion of records retrieved in that table at the very top of the paper, sample size calculation told me that 329 records would be statistically significant at 99% probability, plus or minus 5%. So we drew the sample. Hemju helped. Laura helped. Did you help? Anne helped. Several people helped with that. And we parsed the characteristics, and what we discovered is, curiously, that this is an interesting outlier. Curiously, the dates of publication ran from the 17th century to the present, but look, this whole bump, in other words, the majority of it is after 1978. Well, what does that tell us? That tells us that these are records input since OCLC was invented, and pretty much nothing from the first part of the 20th century is represented. So that means we don't have representative data about the whole 20th century. You see all those little blue squares in these tables. I took out the statistics because they tend to confuse catalogers when I gave the paper, but there you can see every blue cell is a place where the row value predicts the column value or vice versa. Now there's no causation in there. I can't tell you why it happens. I can just tell you that I'm 99% certain that if you drew the sample again, you would find that A predicts B and so on. So I thought it might be interesting then for you to see this paper, which I gave, nope, wrong one. All my papers have the same title, so it gets confusing. All right, this is the paper I gave in Krakow, and what you see is the same thing, don't you? Same methodology, exactly, but not with 9 million OCLC records. In this case, with 100,000 records from the Catholic University in Logan, which gave us their online catalog to study. But I found exactly a mirror effect. Same distribution, just slightly smaller. There were fewer in the subject distribution. They show you, well, here the population of the main classes. You can't see this, but what it's showing you is that in OCLC, like 2/3 of it is hard science, and at Leuven, 2/3 of it is humanities. And it makes sense that an arts and sciences program in a Belgian university would be predominantly humanistic and not predominantly sciences. But that was the second study. and the third study is now underway and due in a few weeks. All right, in the third study, I am going back to all those categories that you saw. It said ISBN or it said publisher. I'm now looking at the values of each of those things to see whether those values predict co-occurrence. I'm starting with subject headings and specific terms. Interestingly, by the way, the OCLC people had almost no subject headings. They don't use subject headings. They just input keywords in the bibliographic records. They think subject headings are useless. The reason we chose the library at Leuven is because for many years now they have used inverted classification instead of subject headings. If the UDC number is, 311 or something, what you see in their catalog is what that string would look like in the classification: social science, sociology, population studies, and blah, blah. And those terms are kept together, so the context is always provided. They find users are able to achieve precision much more rapidly that way. So I had this other study where I alluded to it before. Maybe there's some interesting pictures. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I did go to the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and I spent about 6 months in the archives and in the basement. I got introduced to everybody. I met the preservationists. I chose these 8 artifacts, which were the first 8 things I could see when I walked in the door on display. They were Etruscan artifacts, terracotta hut urn. This looked like a little house. The footed bowl, the olpe, which was for, here's the cinerary urn that was for ashes. The antefix with satyr head was a decoration above a door frame. The lintel is that thing at the top of the door frame, and they were written on, so they were informative, so I chose that because it said something. And then I just followed them in the museum from when they were dug up to when they were acquired, to when they were loaned out, and so on. I learned 2 things. The first is that every department in the museum has a different vocabulary, and they're not the same. So if you wanted to develop an information system for a museum, you'd have to take care of the fact that there are 14 different vocabularies going on at once. And libraries, we tend to have just one and force everybody to use it. The other thing I learned was that they create instantiation. They create these huge problems in their own information systems. If I look up terracotta hut urn, I get 1,600 responses, and they all have something to do with that thing. Some of them are photos, some of them are clay models that the preservationists made to see what it would look like if they broke it apart and put it back together that way, and on and on and on. Whenever they send something out to exhibit, they photograph it, and then it's photographed at the exhibit. They own those. It comes back and they photograph it again, and on and on and on. So inside the museum, there was this problem of disambiguation as well. And I learned it just by sitting there and watching them and seeing what they did with my 8 little artifacts. So that was a research stream born from the same dissertation. All right, so we have a whole lot of time left. I was telling somebody, when people find out that we teach online here, they always say, oh, that must be so much easier. And we say, no. Anyone can walk in a room and talk for 2 hours. See? But to actually write it all down in advance before the students get antsy about it, and make sure you haven't made a mistake, and all their interfaces work, and everything else is hard work. What I would like you to do is think of some, if you have a laptop with you, some article you're working with now, some piece of research you are working with now. Look at its introduction and its literature review and see if you can figure out where the research question came from. Are there enough of you with anything handy to... Are there any extroverts who don't mind popping up? very few published articles actually say the research question is colon. It's usually very colloquially in the narrative.
We used to have this activity where we identified the research problem and a research question, and I haven't annotated. I have annotated one.
Just tell us about that.
Okay, so let's see. Okay, so this place was workplace user frustration with computers, an exploratory investigation of the causes and severity. And basically the research problem indicated that there is a disturbing portion of computer users suffer from negative affective reactions toward the computer, which can subsequently affect whether or not they use it and whether or not they use it effectively. And the question itself was to examine the role of computers in like a workplace setting and the possible consequences of its use.
So where did the question come from? Can you see what prior research fielded?
Yeah, the U.S. National Telecommunications and Information Administration reports looked at employed people using hardware work. And then researchers began to focus on the possible consequences of such use in different environments. So the authors pulled from multiple other sources, and then sort of, it looks like it's just like a shorter introduction in terms of the past history on it.
Okay.
But from the early 90s through 2001, this was done in 2006.
Good. Sequential. Anybody else? Nobody else.
Everybody should suppose to have one. People in the class, they always supposed to find one article, look at the research problem, research question. So.
Well, see, my question is, where did it come from? Yes,
I have one that is probably coming from the beginning. It's a study where there was a library, and they and it matters to know that they are one of two Dutch studies PhD granting institutions. They had never before asked their users about library services to the deaf, whether or not they were doing a good job. And when they went into the literature review, they found nobody else had either. And so not them who. So the research problem came out of the lack of anything. So they became the beginning.
Excellent. Excellent. That's great.
I have one of our favorite articles. It's the Shepherd and Son ontology as boundary object, and they're examining the problem is that there are communication gaps in the medical environment, and they were trying to determine whether a specific ontology addressed the communication gaps just by serving as sort of a key developed boundary objects.
What's the origin of the question?
The origin of the question? They had specific disorders that required or benefited from multidisciplinary care management, and there were issues with communication that they were trying to address.
Yeah, I have one written by Sam, who's just talking about the destruction of the technology in classroom. And from the review, a lot of research that has been on or has carried on about the use of laptops, smartphones, tablets in the class, and the concentration of the student in the class. So there are a lot of arguments within some people from the previous research related that is allowed students can use because it facilitates technology and enhance academic excellence. The other one argue that the distraction was because based on the other research studies show that the concentration are less, given which one of the research that in an hour of average, a student only concentrates for 25 minutes out of the full an hour. So the research question I have seen here is how does two research question? How does the increasing prevalence of student access to information, communication, technology devices involving wireless network connectivity, include smartphones, laptops in the classroom, affect the quality of teaching and learning? And the other question is trying to see the consequences, benefits, and cost to students themselves, classmates and teachers when students choose to access the personalized ICT.
Okay, so sorry, I have knees, old knees. Okay, so what I was interested in, or what I got interested in while you were talking, was the 5 minutes that are missing. You said they were only concentrating for 25 minutes of the 30-minute period.
Yeah, according to the review I have read in relation to that, there are such one really quoted that he did a research showing that in an hour class activities, that 5 minutes were distracted by students using their electronic gadget. The 25 minutes is more of academic concentration. So now this is a great defect for academic learning. Now trying to see is that what they are doing for the last 5 minutes, concentration all related to the academic work? Or is it a different thing? And if it is, what kind of a thing are really distracting them?
Right, so that's great. I would have gone, I mean, I didn't hear you, it sounded like you just said it this time. The first time I didn't hear it in the research question, but I would have gone directly after that missing 5 minutes. What are they doing then? Why is that happening? There is a problem of cognitive overload, people to shut down when there's too much input. And there's also the problem of what we're accustomed to. You know, if you do a lot of public speaking, you'll eventually learn that if you don't do something dramatic or change the subject every 3.5 minutes, you lose them. And that's because that's the space between two television commercials. So people are able to listen to you for that long, and then if there's not a commercial, they quit. So if you're not going to have commercial messages, you've got to do something, jump up and down, wave your arms, scream, change the subject, but you have to keep it changing or people just stop listening. So we should test that. That's great.
So the research, I think someone has quoted again, argue that there is no need for even disallowing students using their gadget because you compare it with the window of a classroom. It's at the same. Naturally, some students can concentrate looking at the outside environment or looking at the bed or whatever. So you just argue on that. It's the same thing. So just like I'm just seeing like just something arguing between the two. But the most interesting thing is that most of the reviewers are trying to defend their position by some say professor and student fight. There's an article, and he mentioned that whenever one of the techniques he uses, like when he comes to the class, he makes sure that the wireless is kind of class. And the other side, the other argue that if the awareness is part of the academic, like this one is doing, using awareness to just do it. So it facilitates you to just look at into your record and get the student know. And at the same time, you can borrow the wireless network, but still distraction is there.
I'm laughing because I've discovered when I go to the doctor that they cut off the Wi-Fi in the examining room somehow. So they want to know, how many milligrams of that are you taking? And I pull out my iPhone because, of course, it's in my pharmacy account, and I look at it and it won't load. Well, I don't know. You got to give me Wi-Fi. I can't memorize all that. And then there's the problem that no matter what I type, it changes it to something else. Okay, anybody else? Since you're in my class, we'll meet next week, and I want your 140-page paper to take a research question and trace it backward and discover where it came from empirically. So the other thing I would have done had we had another day was just ask you, especially those of you who are working on dissertations, to pony up what you're working on and let us analyze it in that way. So I won't do that to you just now. But at your defenses, be prepared. That's a joke. If I'm not on your committee, I can't do anything. Okay, so the other thing that I do quite a lot these days is called meta-analysis. And I just thought of that while he was talking because it occurred to me, given how INTJ I am, it's something that I would naturally gravitate to. But meta-analysis is when you pull together all the research on a subject, on a phenomenon, whether it's alike or not, and then you study it exhaustively to figure out what they've all discovered that they haven't discovered they've discovered. And one way I do that is simply to make a table of who found what. And, you have Jones and Smith, and Jones found 42% and Smith found red. And you're wondering, well, how can I make sense out of that? And then you discover they were both looking at rocks on the bottom of Menominee River. Oh, same river. So now you can figure out what the rocks came from the same place, what might have caused them to have these things in common. You could even cast a hypothesis that they would be read with some proportion of time. You can always cast a wrong hypothesis because it's a really good way to learn. You think it's going to be 25% and it turns out it's 93%. It's a big surprise. But meta-analysis is also a good way to generate research questions. So let's just remember, you have to be precise, sequential, what will answer my question? Okay, I made a little bit fun. Sukwan wrote a great paper. Don't let you think I'm making fun of him. But the first day, all he could say was semantic web, semantic web, semantic web. Well, in the end, what he studied were articles about the semantic web appearing in the top 3% of works with that keyword indexed by the Web of Science. Okay? Now, that's a long statement, but it's incredibly precise. And why was it the top 3%? Because there were something like 180,000 citations. We couldn't study the whole thing. But it had a Bradford distribution, right? So we grabbed the top rank of the distribution. He studied it. So it has to be absolutely precise and identify the context. And with that, I think I'll stop. Or take questions. Whatever you want.
So this, I hope, isn't too much of a tangent, but one of the questions that I have in science generally, one thing that we strive towards, I guess, is repeatability. In information science generally, at least looking at the quantitative side, do you see much work that's actually repeating the kinds of questions that have come before? I mean, like, very much so, not taking it and changing it slightly, but actually going back and retesting hypotheses that from prior publication.
The word, I think, is replicability.
Yeah, sorry.
I do see that. I mean, it's not necessarily obvious. There are a lot of people who are told they won't get tenure if they do something like that. And so they disguise it as preliminary background pilot study for the next thing. But the most recent project of that, I mean, the first project that springs to mind was the whole Trek project. That's a historical line of work in information retrieval where they built a database, they knew what was in it, and then they tried different experimental approaches to retrieve what they knew was there. And they failed most of the time, but at least they knew what didn't work. And that's how they got better and better, but by testing the same hypotheses over and over. The recent effort I'm aware of is called music information retrieval. And when I started working with them in the year 2000, they wanted to know how to break musical sound apart so that it could be reassembled from any one or two pieces. And to do that, they had to do the same experiments over and over and over and over. They had to distinguish the pitch from the timbre, from the beat, from all the space, and all sorts of things, the intervals. And their great triumph was, I believe, around 2005. I was there. They had a conference in Paris, and they made The Economist because they had invented what they called query by humming. And now you have it in your iPhone. You just sing a little bit of the tune, and the system tells you what that is. But that was a huge, multi-year, scientists all over the world working on Grant's effort at replication to get the results absolutely precise. So it does happen.
Any other questions?
How are we doing with that 3.5 minute thing?
In your first introduction, you mentioned the research is not linear, but sequential. And how can you just simplify by an example of what you have done? Whether you're trying to say, like, I think you mentioned statement saying that you just finished the last part of your dissertation. Yeah? Theoretically, you renewed it for long?
So this is how the markers all get on the other side. I went too fast. So that little thing called bin classification I showed you, the first table came from a study of instantiation in the library catalog. The second study came from historical analysis of quantum theory and bibliography based at the Mons the Mundenam Museum of Oakleys Papers in Mons, Belgium. And the third study was the study of the Wikipedia network structure. So that doesn't look like a straight line, does it? Yeah. But they were in sequence, even though they were all topically different. I used found phenomena from each study to generate the new study. That's what I mean.
Okay, mean like now, if somebody has taken a particular field, like an information studies, is specialized maybe statistics start an installation. So that means sequentially you should go on that without touching the other aspect maybe of information organization or anything. You're trying to just give like a guide, somebody should be more fanatic and want to after that. Or not diversified.
I think that what you said is correct.
Right.
I got to thinking while you were talking, so it's always dangerous. You know, we know when they say there's a 80% probability of rain that we're going to get wet. And the reason we know that is because they've been measuring that every day for a couple of hundred years. And they have satellites that measure it from all around the globe. And they have huge databases where all that is put together and scientifically tested constantly. So we can rely on that probability. In information science, we have almost nothing. We have a field, knowledge organization is about 170 years old. Information science really, as we know it, was generated in the 1950s and 1960s, so it's really only 50 years old. Every study is a new thing. There's not yet a lot of replication. We don't have depth. We have a lot of breadth. So practically anything you're interested in, we don't know anything about it because nobody studied it yet. So there's always the opportunity to go in all those directions you suggested, just one at a time. That's the best thing to do that. But one thing we need to build in our field, we need to build large theoretical knowledge banks, places where we know with certainty of meteorologists what will happen when when two phenomena come together. The Edward Snowden people, the NSA, have been doing this. We let them get ahead of us, didn't we? We probably know what they know, but we don't know that we know it. We probably can mine data every bit as well as they do, and for better purpose. But we have to do the experimental work first to see how that can function. That's how, and you should memorize that. That's how I scare people in the supermarket when they say, "What do you teach?" That thing Edward Snowden said, I can teach. Or my doctor's office when they ask me four-stupid questions, and I say, "I teach how to design a system so that the questions you ask won't be so stupid." This is why they keep giving me more drugs. So, yes.
I have a question about the big RQ and little RQ. So just, can you clarify, I think I got the difference. So the big RQ is like, the big picture, little R research question would be like how it actually functions within the project. But is it like each project has a big focus and then the little focus?
When you were introducing yourselves, and I asked Jeanette to tell us what her dissertation was, and she knew the next thing I was going to say was the one-sentence version. So I always make my students do that first, and you're next. So, and that's the big RQ. This was a study of instantiation of library catalogs. The real first RQ was, what is the proportion of multiple editions in Georgetown University Library, in English, published after 1850. That's highly specific, but that's what I knew was in that catalog, and that was what I could study. And the proportion shocked everybody. It was something like 89%. People said, "Oh, that's not really a problem." But yeah, the big picture is the colloquial RQ. The operational RQ is the one that's highly precise and defines the context.
And so within each project or each study, there would be both.
Yes.
The big picture and then the operational focus.
Right.
question or the way the question will be answered.
In trying to answer my question, like you mentioned, like information science is still in 1950, but I thought this is still an argument. People are, isn't is still now our identity has not been found as it's a new, or something not related to documentation yourself. When you look at the art,
Just sit down for that. All right. Information science could be traced, arguably, to Paul Outlet and his theories in the 1870s. There's a wonderful book, if you read French, the title is Traité de documentation, and if you find a paper copy, you're very lucky. But you can get it from his archives. But in that, he sets out the whole apparatus by which what he wants to do is take texts and deconstruct them by taking the ideas out of them and putting the ideas in separate places and then reassembling them in useful packets. And he's got a drawing of a train, and the books are going into this big thing called the grinder, and then at the bottom it spits out little bits of sentences that go into these cars on the train. That's pulling us into modern society. All right, but there are whole chapters in there on how to do this quantitatively. He just was really precise about it. And this is what became what we now call informametrics, was how to measure a given graphical phenomenon precisely.
So, Richard, my class is scheduled in here right now.
All right.
2 o'clock. Yeah, we'll finish it at 2 o'clock, so we're done.
So there's arguably that history. The word information science was not used in the literature until the 1960s.
Thank you.
You're welcome.